welcome to episode 215 of Manage the Wild. I'm your host, Nick Madsen. Today we're going to talk about a controversy that's brewing in California, and no, it's not over who they're going to pick for senator. We're talking about wildlife. The controversy is taking place on Catalina Island. And the controversy is that the state of California, as well as a conservancy group, want to kill roughly 2,000, there's 1,800 mule deer on the island, and they want to cull them. They're going to bring in a company and kill them all. And so in this episode, we're going to talk about why that is, what it is, and are there other options. Culling. What is culling? Culling is basically a way to control a population. They'll bring in a company or a bunch of hunters, and if the population is growing unchecked and causing problems, then they'll bring them in and they'll kill them off. In the instances of culling I'm aware of, a lot of it has been the population has grown too large, or there's disease, or they are destroying all the crops. And so one of the easiest ways is to cull the herd. In all these situations, you can do it a couple of different ways. One, you can bring in a professional company to come in, just like they're doing hogs in the South. They're bringing companies in and shooting hogs with ARs. And this is the plan for Catalina Island. The other situations I've seen where you are culling a herd is you are bringing in hunters of some kind. Doesn't have to be commercial. You can give out licenses and they can go in and they can hunt these animals, and so you can reduce the population. Whether the population's gotten out of control or disease or whatever, culling is an option that they can use. There are other ways that you can try to reduce the effects instead of getting rid of or culling animals. You can go in and use birth control. That one's been tried before. It's effective up to a certain point, but it's really expensive and you have to dart a lot of animals. All the females have to be darted for you to be able to effectively reduce the population. And you can't, targeting males isn't necessarily going to help because one male will still be able to service a lot of females. So in the opposite, you have to start injecting birth control into all the females, and that could be a hard task to, because you got to be able to identify whether you've darted that animal before or not. Some of the, when they're injected, some of the drugs may not penetrate as well, so you may not get a very good dose, and so the birth control may be ineffective that way. You can use some chemical repellents and non-lethal repellents, but ultimately, if your population is growing and you don't want them to grow anymore, chemical repellents isn't going to work. Translocation has been thought of, but the one issue that you're going to have with translocation, if there's disease in any of the deer and you start to move them and they're diseased, then you're moving disease from one population to another, and that's going to be a little bit challenging. It's really expensive, and sometimes it's not the most humane way to deal with wildlife because you're transporting them, putting through a lot of stress. Now, the argument there is that by killing the animals, it's not very humane either. So there is that. You have to debate about whether to translocate or not, which is really expensive. And then you could start to fence them out. You could try fencing them out of areas that you want them to not go in, but then you're putting the animals into smaller and smaller enclosures, and that's not necessarily as effective as well, because if you're worried about habitat degradation, which they are on Catalina, then ultimately fencing them off of certain areas is going to put 1,800 deer in a smaller location. That area is going to be affected quicker, and so the conservancy group here wants, their whole job is they have say over 80 to 85% of the island, and their job is to bring it back to that natural component. Well, mule deer were brought in the 1930s, and they have no natural predators, and their population is growing unchecked. This is where I start to be a little bit annoyed, but the fact is they are only giving out roughly 200 tags a year. And if your population is at 1,800 and you are growing and your population's not being reduced and you're now worried about habitat degradation, why were you only giving out 200 permits per year? Why weren't you giving out more long before you got to this point? This is where I don't like culling. Culling and bringing in a professional company with a helicopter to shoot these means that sportsmen who are paying the majority for wildlife are now not getting an opportunity to come in and harvest that said wildlife. So if you look at the vast majority of the dollars that cover and fund wildlife, it's coming from sportsmen. And so by bringing in a professional company to aerial gun these deer, which is what they plan on doing with helicopters, then the sportsmen lose out on that fact. So the sportsmen are paying for somebody else to harvest animals that they are the ones who are paying for. So that's always been my thing. Culling should be the last option. And it's yeah, it should just be the last option, in my opinion. You should use the sportsmen who are willing and who are able to come in to remove those animals. Now, there is controversy about whether you should be hunting those animals or not. And California is one of those states that is leading more and leaning more towards not hunting versus hunting. And the challenge that they're going to have is the more they push away from that hunting scenario, the more the costs are going to be fronted by everybody else. And sportsmen are more willing to be able to pay for wildlife. They've shown that from throughout all of wildlife management here in the United States, that as the prices have increased, that people are more than willing to pay for those increases to have the opportunity to go and harvest an animal. And so if the states are going to lean more towards these commercial companies instead of relying on hunters, that's going to change the dynamics of how and why wildlife are managed here in the United States. Now, I can't say whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. I do know that I don't like California's system of doing things. They're not very hunter friendly, or their policies don't seem to be, especially when you have a population like this where you have 200 animals being removed each year, but yet now they're pulling out over 1,800 animals. So the California's wildlife management team has decided that with the conservancy group that the best method of removing these animals is going to be to cull them. So they're going to come in and they're going to completely get rid of all 1,800 animals. Then they're not going to have to deal with it anymore. They've had other animals in there in the past that they've had bison that were brought in. They've had other animals that have been brought in that aren't native, and their goal is to start removing them as quickly as possible to bring it back to that natural and native habitat. And so that's their way of getting rid of it. But people are now upset, and it's not necessarily the hunters that are upset. I think the hunters in California have realized that their state is not very friendly towards them, but it's other groups that are upset. Over 3,500 signatures have gone on the list, and it's growing, about them demanding that these animals not be shot. Some of the groups want to bring in food and water, but we know that when you bring animals together, that you get more disease transferring between one another, and so they're not very excited about that. And so culling is always difficult, whether to cull or not to. And these wildlife management decisions are only more and more controversial. Now, they could have increased the tag numbers long before now and slowly remove that population if that was their ultimate goal. but now you're coming in and you're just shooting 1,800 animals. The plan doesn't say whether they have to pick up the animals or not. They have a big enough homeless problem in California that you would think that they are requiring them to come in and remove the animals so then they could donate them, but it doesn't say. And then there's been other instances. I've read a couple of stories in Australia where they were coming in and removing red stag, and they were culling those animals, and they just shot them and left them. They weren't required to take them out. So the debate over to cull or not to cull these animals just shows how difficult it is, and the tasks and the challenges the wildlife managers have to face. There's this balance about pleasing the public, but also doing what's right for the habitat. We know that the habitat is being degraded. You can do your studies and you can show that too many mouths to feed creates too many problems, and you have to reduce that population, especially where a system like Catalina's has evolved with no large ungulates on it. And then to bring them in, of course, there's going to be habitat degradation. But whether you remove the animals completely, it's hard to say. They're wanting to bring it back to what it was before, but they're only going to do that through removing mule deer, but they're not getting rid of roads and they're not getting rid of houses and buildings. So technically, they're just not, because houses and buildings and all those other things cause habitat degradation as well because you're removing habitat. But the easiest step is always wildlife, so they're going after mule deer. This will be one of those challenges that you have to decide. Do we just reduce the population? Do we get rid of them completely? And what method do we use? I'm glad I'm not having to face that. It's like the wild horse or the feral horse problem. What do you do there? That's hard to say. That's all I got for today. You guys have a great day. Stay wild.